Hi there, I'm Patch, and you'll be reading with me today. Today we're going to be reading Night Shift by Stephen King. Did you know that Night Shift is actually a series of short stories? Is everybody ready? Great! Now, let's settle down, grab some cocoa, and let's begin. Pocket Journal of Calvin McCann, October 25th, 1850. Mr. Boone has slept nearly all this day. His face is pallid and much thinner. I fear recurrence of his fever is inevitable. While refreshing his water carafe, I caught sight of 2 unmailed letters to Mr. Granson in Florida. He plans to return to Jerusalem's lot. 'Twill be the killing of him if I allow it. Dare I steal away to Preacher's Corners and hire a buggy? I must, and yet what if he wakes? If I should return and find him gone? The noises have begun in our walls again. Thank God he still sleeps. My mind shudders from the import of this. Later. I brought him his dinner on a tray. He plans on rising later, and despite his evasions, I know what he plans. Yet I go to Preacher's Corners. Several of the sleeping powders prescribed to him during his late illness remained with my things. He drank one with his tea, all unknowing. He sleeps again. To leave him with the things that shamble behind our walls terrifies me. To let him continue even one more day within these walls terrifies me even more greatly. I have locked him in. God grant he should still be there, safe and sleeping, when I return with the buggy. Still later. Stoned me like a wild and rabid dog. Monsters and fiends, these that call themselves men. We are prisoners here. The birds, the whippoorwills, have begun to gather. October 26th, 1850. Dear Bones, it is nearly dusk, and I have just wakened, having slept the last 24 hours away. Although Cal has said nothing, I suspect he put a sleeping powder in my tea, having gleaned my intentions. He is a good and faithful friend, intending only the best, and I shall say nothing. Yet my mind is set. Tomorrow is the day. I am calm, resolved, but also seem to feel the subtle onset of the fever again. If it is so, it must be tomorrow. Perhaps tonight would be better yet. Still, not even the fires of hell itself could induce me to set foot in that village by shadowlight. Should I write no more, may God bless and keep you, Bones. Charles. Postscriptum. The birds have set up their cry, and the horrible shuffling sounds have begun again. Cal does not think I hear, but I do. C. The Pocket Journal of Calvin McCann, October 27th, 1850, 5 a.m. He is impersuadable. Very well, I go with him. November 4th, 1850. Dear Bones, weak yet lucid. I am not sure of the date, yet my almanac assures me by tide and sunset that it must be correct. I sit at my desk, where I sat when I first wrote you from Chapelwhite, and look out over the dark sea from which the last light of the light is rapidly fading. I shall never see more. This night is my night. I leave it for whatever shadows be. How it heaves itself at the rocks, this sea! It throws clouds of sea foam at the darkling sky and banners, making the floor beneath me tremble. In the window glass I see my reflection, pallid as any vampire's. I have been without nourishment since the 27th of October, and should have been without water, had not Calvin left the carafe beside my bed on that day. Oh, Cal, he is no more, Bones. He is gone in my place, in the place of this wretch with his pipe-stem arms and skull-face, who I see reflected back in the darkened glass. And yet he may be the more fortunate, for no dreams haunt him as they have haunted me these last days. Twisted shapes that lurk in the nightmare corridors of the delirium. Even now my hands tremble. I have splotched the page with ink. Calvin confronted me on that morning just as I was about to slip away, and I thinking I had been so crafty. I had told him that I had decided we must leave, and asked him if he would go to Tandro, some 10 miles distant, and hire a trap where we were less notorious. He agreed to make the hike, and I watched him leave by the sea road. When he was out of sight, I quickly made myself ready, donning both coat and muffler, for the weather had turned frosty. The first touch of coming winter was on that morning's cutting breeze. I wished briefly for a gun, then laughed at myself for the wish. What avails guns in such a matter? I let myself out by the pantry way, pausing for a last look at sea and sky. For the smell of the fresh air against the putrescence I knew I should smell soon enough. For the sight of a foraging gull wheeling below the clouds. I turned, and there stood Calvin McCann. "You shall not go alone," said he, and his face was as grim as ever I have seen it. "But Calvin," I began. "No, not a word. We go together, and do what we must, or I return you bodily to the house. You are not well. You shall not go alone." It is impossible to describe the conflicting emotions that swept over me. Confusion, pique, gratefulness. Yet the greatest of them was love. We made our way silently past the summer house and the sundial, down the weed-covered verge and into the woods. All was dead still. Not a bird sang, nor a wood cricket chirped. The world seemed cupped in a silent pall. There was only the ever-present smell of salt, and from far away the faint tang of wood smoke. The woods were blazoned riot of color, but to my eye scarlet seemed to predominate all. Soon the scent of salt passed, and another, more sinister odor took its place. That rottenness which I have mentioned when we came to the leaning bridge which spanned the Royal. I expected Cal to ask me again to defer it, but he did not. He paused, looked at that grim spire which seemed to mock the blue sky above it, then looked at me. We went on. We proceeded with quick yet dread footsteps to James Boone's church. The door still hung ajar from our ladder exit, and the darkness within seemed to leer at us. As we mounted the steps, brass seemed to fill my heart. My hand trembled as it touched the door handle and pulled it. The smell within was greater, more noxious than ever. We stepped into the shadowy anteroom, and with no pause into the main chamber. It was a shambles. Something vast had been at work in there, and a mighty destruction had taken place. Pews were overturned and heaped like jacksaws. The wicked cross lay against the east wall, and a jagged hole in the plaster above it testified to the force which with it had been hurled. The oil lamps had been ripped from their high fixtures, and the reek of whale oil mingled with the terrible stink which pervaded the town. And down the center aisle, like a ghastly bridle path, was a trail of black ichor, mingled with the sinister trails of blood. Our eyes followed it to the pulpit, and the only untouched thing in view, atop it, staring at us from across that blasphemous book with glazed eyes, was the body of a butchered lamb. "God," Calvin whispered. We approached, keeping clear of the slime on the floor. The room echoed back our footsteps that seemed to transmute them into a sound of gigantic laughter. We mounted the narthex together. The lamb had not been torn or eaten, it appeared, rather to have been squeezed until its blood vessels had forcibly ruptured. Blood lay in thick and noisome puzzles on the lectern itself, and about the base of it. Yet on the book it was transparent, and the crabbed runes could be read through it, as through colored glass. "Must we touch it?" Cal asked, unfaltering. "Yes, I must have it." "What will you do?" "What should have been done 60 years ago. I'm going to destroy it." We rolled the lamb's corpse away from the book. It struck the floor with a hideous lolling thud. The blood-stained pages now seemed alive with a scarlet glow of their own. My ears began to ring and hum. A low chant seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. From the twisted look on Cal's face, I knew he heard the same. The floor beneath us trembled, as if the familiar which had haunted this church came now unto us to protect its own. The fabric of sane space and time seemed to twist and crack. The church seemed filled with spectres and litten with the hell glow of eternal cold fire. It seemed that I saw James Boone, hideous and misshapen, cavorting around the supine body of a woman, and my grand-uncle Philip behind him, an acolyte in a black hooded cassock, who held a knife and bowl. Denum vobiscum magnum vernus. The words shuddered and writhed on the page before me, soaked in the blood of sacrifice, prize of a creature that shambles beyond the stars. A blind, interbred congregation swaying in mindless, demonic praise. Deformed faces filled with hungering, nameless anticipation. And the Latin was replaced by an older tongue, ancient when Egypt was young and the pyramids unbuilt, ancient when this earth still hung in an unformed, boiling ferment of empty gas. Giagan Vadar Yaskothsagoth. Verminis. Gaiagan, Gaiagan, Gaiagan. The pulpit began to rend and split, pushing upward. Calvin screamed and lifted an arm to shield his face. The narthex trembled with a huge, tenebrous motion like a ship racked in a gale. I snatched up the book and held it away from me. It seemed filled with the heat of the sun, and I felt that I should have been cindered, blinded. "Run!" Calvin screamed. "Run!" But I stood frozen, and the alien presence filled me like an ancient vessel had waited for years, for generations. "Gaiagan Vardar," I screamed, "servant of Yoggoth-Sagoth, the Nameless One, the worm from beyond space, star-eater, blinder of time, Verminis. Now comes the hour of filling, the time of rending, Verminis. Alia, Alia, Gaiagan." Calvin pushed me and I tottered, the church whirling before me, and fell to the floor. My head crashed against the edge of an upturned pew, and red fire filled my head. It seemed to clear it. I groped for the sulphur matches I had brought. Subterranean thunder filled the place. Plaster fell, the rusted bell in the steeple pealed a choked devil's carillon in sympathetic vibration. My match flared. I touched it to the book just as the pulpit exploded upward in a rending explosion of wood. A huge black maw was discovered beneath. Cal tottered on the edge, his hands held out, his face distended in a wordless scream that I shall hear forever. And then there was a huge surge of grey, vibrating flesh. The smell became a nightmare tide. It was a huge outpouring of viscid, pestilent jelly, a huge and awful form that seemed to skyrocket from the very bowels of the ground. And yet, with such a horrible comprehension, which no man can have known, I perceived that it was but one ring, one segment of a monster worm that had existed eyeless for years in the chambered darkness beneath that abominated church. The book flared alight in my hands, and the thing seemed to scream soundlessly above me. Calvin was struck glancingly and flung the length of the church like a doll with a broken neck. It subsided. The thing subsided, leaving only a huge and shattered hole with the black slime, and a great screaming, mewling sound that seemed to fade through colossal distances and was gone. I looked down. The book was ashes. I began to laugh, then to howl like a struck beast. All sanity left me, and I sat on the floor with blood streaming from my temple, screaming and gibbering into those unhallowed shallows, while Calvin sprawled in the far corner, staring at me with glazing, horror-struck eyes. I have no idea how long I existed in that state. It is beyond all telling. That when I came again to my faculties, Shouted had drawn long paths around me, and I sat in twilight. Movement had caught my eye, movement from the shattered hole in the narthex floor. A hand groped its way over the riven floorboards. My mad laughter choked in my throat. All hysteria melted into numb bloodlessness. With terrible, vengeful slowness, a racked figure pulled itself up from darkness, and a half-skull peered at me. Beetles crawled over the fleshless forehead. A rotted cassock clung to the askew hollows of mouldered collarbones. Only the eyes lived. Red, insane pits that glared at me with more than lunacy. They glared with the empty life of the pathless wastes beyond the edges of the universe. He came to take me down to darkness. That was when I fled, screeching, leaving the body of my lifelong friend unheeded in that place of dread. The odd series of papers above was eventually received by Mr. Everett Granson, to whom they had been addressed. It is assumed that a recurrence of the unfortunate brain fever which struck him originally following the death of his wife in 1848 caused Charles Boone to lose his sanity and murder his companion and lifetime friend, Mr. Calvin McCann. The entries in Mr. McCann's pocket journal are a fascinating exercise in forgery, undoubtedly perpetuated by Charles Boone in an effort to reinforce his own paranoid delusions. In at least two particulars, however, Charles Boone is proved wrong. First, when the town of Jerusalem's lot was rediscovered, I use the term historically, of course, the floor of the narthex, although rotted, showed no sign of explosion or huge damage. Although the ancient pews were overturned and several windows shattered, this can be assumed to be the work of vandals from neighboring towns over the years. Among the older residents of Preacher's Corners and Tandril there is still some idle rumor about Jerusalem's lot. Perhaps in his day it was this kind of harmless folk legend which started Charles Boone's brain on its fatal course. But this seems hardly relevant. Second, Charles Boone was not the last of his line. His grandfather, Robert Boone, sired at least 2 bastards. One died in infancy. The second took the Boone name and located in the town of Central Falls, Rhode Island. I am the final descendant of this offshoot of the Boone line. Charles Boone's second cousin, removed by 3 generations. These papers have been in my committal for 10 years. I offer them for publication on the occasion of my residence in the Boone ancestral home, Chapelwhite, in the hope that the reader will find sympathy in his heart for Charles Boone's poor, misguided soul. So far as I can tell, he was correct about only one thing. This place badly needs the services of an exterminator. There are some huge rats in the walls, by the sound. Signed, James Robert Boone, October 2nd, 1971.